Hi, I'm Yue Xu.
And I'm Julie Kraftchick.
We're active daters turned dating insiders.
Here to dive into everything modern dating and relationships.
Welcome to DATEABLE. Hello, friends.
Welcome back to another episode of DATEABLE.
Let's get intimate and sexy today. Was that a sexy?
That felt really sexy.
It was my deep sexual intimacy voice. But now I'm going to turn it up a notch because we're talking about the science behind intimacy and sex.
That's very sexy.
Oh, okay. Science. I was trying to be less sexy.
You got me at science.
Okay, now you know. Now you all know how our views about science are. I'm trying to be less sexy. And Julie's like, I'm more turned on.
We are so lucky to be joined, though, by Dr. Justin Garcia, who is a lead sex researcher, evolutionary biologist, scientific advisor for the Match Group. He does the Singles in America studies that many of you tend to see, and the executive director of the Kinsey Institute, the world's foremost research center on sexuality and relationships.
And he is the author of the timely and fascinating new book, The Intimate Animal, The Science of Sex, Fidelity, and Why We Live and Die for Love.
And like Yue said, we talk about why we're wired for intimacy, not just sex, and what intimacy really means, what it means to feel that known and connected and bonded with another human being.
And then we define what pair bonding means, why we have this affinity towards pair bonding, and what does that mean for monogamous relationships, polyamorous relationships, non-traditional, and future relationships.
Yeah, we talk a lot about just the changing world that we're in and how modern dating either supports or disrupts pair bonding, and then also what the growing trend that we're seeing more and more single people out there, or people actively choosing to stay single, and what does this mean when it comes to bonding with another human and having a fulfilling and amazing life, whether you meet that person or not.
And in a world where we find that making connection is so tough and so many of us are feeling down about dating and some even giving up on dating, this is a good reminder episode that we are all naturally and biologically wired to connect. It's not something we need to force or work that hard at. We are wired to naturally connect with other humans.
I read this book in maybe 2 days. I loved it so much. It was such a I think a lot of times you hear scientist, lead researcher. And there was a lot of dense points in there, don't get me wrong, but he also wrote it in a way that was very accessible, fast read. And what I just felt the whole time is this makes sense, why we put this emphasis on finding a partner and then being with someone and all the effort that comes with it, whether it's dating or just sustaining the relationship. When we look at it, it is a lot of effort. Sometimes it does feel easier to just do life on your own. But the benefits that you get from integrating another person into life and the bond that just is like no other, I just felt I don't know, kind of warm and fuzzy reading it. And then hopeful, I think, if you maybe aren't in that position but want to be there, it feels this is a reminder of why it's all worth it.
And I think it's a reminder we all need in a world right now where we're sort of I don't need nobody. Yeah. I'm going to be independent. I'm self-sufficient. I can do life on my own. The best was I was reading this fiction book, and in it, this woman's she's grappling with this idea of I don't need no man. The world tells me I don't need a man. And then she goes, yes, it's true. I don't need a man, but I want love and I want to feel love. And I thought that was such a vulnerable and honest look at humanity. It's yes, we may not need this other human to survive anymore, but the need for love is real.
I think a lot of dialogue today of just the boyfriends are embarrassing now article and just vowing for a life of celibacy. It's I don't know if that's really truly what we want. If that is truly what you want, go for it.
Sure.
No one's saying that. But if you really do want love, but you're just frustrated or discouraged or whatever it may be, the answer isn't just saying I don't need anyone.
Yeah.
It's decentering, which we've talked about on this podcast, but again, doesn't mean decentering is I'm giving up, I'm not doing it anymore. It's I'm still making this a priority because I believe in it and I'm open to love, even if it doesn't like dictate my whole world.
Right, exactly. So good episode for everybody who's
Meaty
feeling
episode,
it.
Yes.
Who's feeling it. Whether you're coupled or you are single, this is an episode that reflects back humanity at you and reminds you why it's so special to be a human being.
And you know what it really pairs well with? Our book.
I was like, a glass of wine.
That too. That too. Pair bonding, both books, but one might be a little lighter, one might be a little more serious, but they both correspond together.
That's so cute. Yes, that's just such a cute visual.
It is.
Pair bonding with a book and a glass of wine.
So anyways, go get our book, go get Justin's book. Amazon's having a massive book sale right now if you haven't seen. So go check it out. Or if you prefer to support local, we're obviously all for that. You go to howtobedateable.com and get the list of where our book is sold. Okay. Well, before we get into it with Justin, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. I'm so excited to tell you about our sponsor, Avocado Green Mattress. Their certified organic mattresses are specifically designed to relieve pressure points, support your body the way it needs, and help you actually get the deep restorative sleep you've been missing. Every mattress is made with thoughtfully sourced materials and built with real care, so you get incredible sleep night after night. When I invest in something for my home, I want it to last, but I also want it to feel amazing every day. My best friend has an avocado mattress and it is so comfortable. I swear I'm over there and I just want to take a nap. The best part is they're not only just good for you, they're good for the planet. Avocado products are made, not manufactured, thoughtfully crafted with real materials to deliver lasting comfort and support. Go to avocadogreenmattress.com/dateable to check out their mattress and furniture sale. That's avocadogreenmattress.com/dateable, avocadogreenmattress.com/dateable.
I've been doing a little spring reset with my closet lately, focusing more on quality over quantity. Just building a wardrobe of pieces that are well-made, versatile, and easy to reach for every day. And that's why I keep coming back to Quince. The fabrics feel elevated, the fits are thoughtful, and the pricing actually makes sense. Quince makes beautiful everyday pieces using premium materials like 100% European linen, organic cotton, and super soft denim, with styles starting at just $50. So I've been on the hunt for the perfect pair of jeans. I don't want them to be skinny jeans, but I don't want them to be too wide-legged either. And let me tell you, I found the perfect pair at Quince. Their Bella Stretch Relax Straight jeans fit me like a glove. I look damn good in them, and they feel so comfortable and soft. They're my go-to jeans now. Refresh your spring wardrobe with Quince. Go to quince.com/dateable for free shipping and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. Go to quince.com/dateable for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/dateable.
Okay, let's hear it from Dr. Justin Garcia.
Justin, welcome. Let's get intimate. Let's just get right into it. We're going to get intimate.
Well, we're so excited to get into the science of sex and intimacy and why we live and die for love and why we're all intimate animals like your book talks about.
Help us define what is the difference between intimacy and sex? Because a lot of times when we say, oh, the intimacy, a lot of people are just referring to sex.
This is such an important point, and I think it's important for how we're using these words. And so often, you're right, intimacy is used as a euphemism for sex or sexual behavior. I don't like euphemisms as someone who studies sex and relationships. They're fun, they have a place, but when we are thinking about these terms, when I think of intimacy, I think of the closeness that comes with romantic and sexual relationships. And not just connection and not just closeness, but this idea of being seen and heard and understood by another person. That's different from just saying, I have these people in my office I see every day. I have neighbors I see every day. I have some friends that are general friends, but the folks that we're really close with, that we feel seen and heard and understood. Psychiatrists sometimes use the term being witnessed, that you want someone to witness who you are and your story. That's intimacy for me. It's a connection with depth. And for our romantic lives, sex is a big part of that, but it's not the only piece of it. And understanding how the tensions between our sexual desires and sex in intimacy is something we could talk a lot about, and I hope we will. But intimacy for me is really this power and the desire for this deep closeness.
You believe that humans are wired for intimacy and not just sex. Like, what does evolutionary psychology tell us about this need to feel what you were just describing of like that deeper connection that goes beyond just, the day-to-day interactions with other human beings?
Yes, you said it so well. And there's so many pieces of this puzzle when we try to understand who are we as people? Who are we? What are we? What do we want? Why do we want it? And fundamentally, we are a social primate in my worldview. I'm trained in biology and anthropology as an evolutionist, and I think that we are a social primate. From there, I think that gives us a lens to think about things that all three of us are interested in, about dating and relationships and connection, but also sex and our social lives and the tensions that exist. We know that humans around the globe for millions of years have lived in these social communities, that we have this legacy of being a social primate. But about 4 million years ago in our species' evolution, we saw social monogamy emerge, these patterns of forming romantic bonds, what we call pair bonds in evolutionary sciences. Only about 3 to 5% of mammals do this, about 15% of primates, so somewhat a little bit more among primates. Pair bonds are what we would maybe call romantic love in humans. It's an intense bond of mutual territory defense, mutual raising of offspring, mutual resource acquisition. That mutual word comes up over and over. It's this idea that there's a co-pilot, a partner that you go through life with. That legacy has been with us for 4 million years. Now, there's a lot of variation. As evolutionists, our bread and butter is variation and diversity of trait. That's what you actually study as an evolutionist. But that story explains our natural history. And I think that at times we focus a lot on the role of mating and sex and sometimes forget that so much of our sexual lives are couched in terms of long-term relationships. Everywhere that anthropologists have studied, most reproduction happens in long-term pair bonds. Most sexual behavior happens in long-term pair bonds. That we have these patterns of courtship and finding each other, as you've written about, as I've written about, as these reasons why we connect. There's a deep natural history legacy that's tied to that. And I think that's our desire to have a close partner, a co-pilot to experience life with. And then all the other stuff fits into that pattern.
But then you hear people say, well, my lizard brain wants to just have sex. My primal aspect of myself just wants to have sex. Is that just a simplified way of us saying we want connection? Or are the two very different?
Yeah. And I think we have to be cautious. So often I hear people, we invoke these ideas about the natural world, about what, mating is like or sex is like. Like, for instance, I'll hear people all the time say, well, what about bonobos, what used to be called pygmy chimps? And they're more sexual, more peace-loving than common chimpanzees, which are known to be more aggressive. And I've had so many over the years, people say, oh, you're a biologist, you study love and sex. Or what about, we're like bonobos, right? They like to have sex all the time. And that's actually not what you see when you look at the academic evidence on bonobos. They do engage in a lot of sexual activity, non-reproductive sexual activity. It almost always happens in food patches. So it happens when they discover a big patch of food and they don't want to get in a fight over who's going to have the ripest fruit and berries. So they engage in sexual activity. So it's deployed in a particular way. But then we kind of use it as this idea that like, oh, they're like the orgy species. It's like, no, it's not what you see. And the same with wolves. I talked to a group of men recently and they were talking about, well, the alpha wolves, and we have to be these alphas, and say, well, actually, that's not what you see in wolves. There isn't an alpha male. There's an alpha couple. This is great for us, so people who study relationships. Wolf packs typically have an alpha couple, and they're really the parents. That when you look at a wolf pack, mostly you look at typically it's a set of parents and their offspring and their kids, and you're looking at a family unit, right? Not this idea that some male beat his way to the top and isn't in charge of everyone. So I think we have to be cautious. I love that you bring it up because we have to be cautious when we use these examples from the natural world, because often there's some technical aspect of what we go look a little bit deeper. So to your question, I didn't answer your question. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. But to your question about how we think of these dimensions for love and sex, what I think is happening, what I argued in The Intimate Animal, was that we actually have two mechanisms. And when we start to separate them, suddenly I see the world a little bit differently, and I hope others see it differently too, is that we have this adaptation for close connection and intimacy. And in relationship context, that manifests as social monogamy, this desire to be with another person we feel known with. We also have desires for sexual activity and in particular, sexual novelty. So I think when people make these comments about, okay, it's the lizard brain, I just want the sex, but what they're really trying to say, and I'd be cautious about using lizards because they have all sorts of interesting mating patterns, and some of them are parthenogenetic. So they don't engage in mating behavior the way that we do. But I digress. What we see there is then there's a desire for sexual behavior, particularly sexual novelty. So often, so long, we've talked about these as being the same thing. But when we understand them as separate mechanisms, the desire for closeness, the desire for sexual monogamy, or sexual variety, I should say, suddenly we see the tension in so many of our lives. You say, well, I want someone I could trust and confide in, but I also want this new and exciting stuff. And often you look at your partner and say, well, I trust you, but where's the spark?
Right.
Where's that feeling? How that tension plays out in our lives. And I think to your point, what some people are saying is, well, right now I'm just looking for the sexual piece. I'm just looking for the novelty and the excitement. Maybe I'm single, maybe I'm in a relationship. And that's fine. Those pieces can operate independently. At times they're in tension, but in the best case scenario where we see high levels of satisfaction, high psychological and physical health outcomes, we also see people report the best quality sexual experiences are when they're in unison, when we can both find someone we have a deep connection with, but we also satisfy our craving for sexual excitement. Too often, I think people assume it means, okay, does that mean I have to stray or cheat or have casual sex? And I don't think that the evidence necessarily supports that. There are ways you can have that in your primary relationship.
I want to go into the concept of pair bonding a little more because I feel like this is at the core of what you're talking about. I mean, I guess when you hear about it, it's like humans are meant to reproduce and that's what they're put on earth to do. But what I'm hearing from what you were saying earlier is that there is actually immense value in just the closeness and the connection even outside of reproduction that comes from pair bonding. Why does love feel so intense, and why does this closeness exist with a bond that's only in a romantic partner from your research? This idea of what's the real evolutionary legacy? What's the why of our species? What's our purpose? I think it's to love. I think it's to feel to connect. So much comes out of that, whether it's mating, whether it's sexual reproduction. We know that among humans, that in terms of for evolutionists, we talk about natural and sexual selection. We talk about survival of the fittest. But in order to survive and to flourish, so much of that happens in social containers and these social interactions. So some anthropologists will joke it takes a couple to raise a baby, it takes a family to raise a couple, and it takes a village to raise a family. And it's this idea that we're nested in layers of social interaction. Now, in the modern world, for most of us, particularly in the Western world, we're really divorced from that. We often don't live with nuclear families. The way that we date, the way that we connect, the way we maintain long-term relationships and friendships and family networks is very different. But that's part of our natural story. And I think that our desire to form these pair bonds is what's allowed our species to have this magnificent evolutionary story in terms of survival and flourishing. How we think of the built environment, what we've created, what we've done are just sheer population size on the planet. Now, someone could also say, well, actually, we grew too fast, we're destroying the Earth. And that's fine, fair enough. There's an argument to be made there. But in strict evolutionary terms, we've done pretty well as a species over the last few million years. Our pair bonds have been part of that story, that we form these bonds, that we're able to invest long-term in offspring. The fact that women gestate 9 to 10 months with a pregnancy, that kids take, at least a decade to raise to where they're somewhat sufficient. But in reality, I'm on a university campus and we see these 18-year-olds come as freshmen and they're not fully fledged. Their parents are still helping them financially, emotionally. They might move back home after they graduate. That is an enormous investment for a species, about a quarter of a century that you invest in offspring. That's fairly atypical when you look around at, look at the bunnies in your garden. They're not spending that much time on raising their offspring. That tells us a story about social connection and families and long-term relationships. That doesn't mean relationships have to last a lifetime, but to know that there's a network, and maybe you're being partly raised by a step-parent. There's all sorts of ways this can be constructed. But I think back to your question, Julie, your point was, when we think about that, we also, when we look at the diversity and variation,
in the world around us, suddenly things make more sense when we think about these family networks. So in the book, I mention this example from Samoa, the Fa'afāine, and it's a culturally recognized third gender. So they typically, Fa'afāine are natal males. They're born male. They present, actually, the direct translation is in the manner of a woman. So they, not in the same way we think about trans in the U.S. today, very culturally specific. But family units that have a Fa'afāine, they tend to not ever have their own kids. Those family units do better because they basically have this third caretaker. They have this kind of queer auntie figure in the family that helps raise the kids, that helps take care of the home. And then as an evolutionist, that's adaptive. That means that family unit has better rates of reproduction and survival because they have another caretaker. So I bring that up because I think we get so focused on this idea, well, evolution is all about reproduction. Yes and no. Evolution is about passing on traits, but that doesn't mean that the only way to do that is by going and having lots of kids. You need the infrastructure to take care of those kids, to raise those kids. And that means that we have lots of interesting quirks in our biology about how individuals, couples, and families move our genes into the next generation. And that's a lot about care. It's a lot about connection. It's a lot about love and surrounding those young with the resources they need to thrive.
I'm going to ask kind of a complicated question because I think about my trajectory without kids and versus my friends who do have kids. So one good example is my friend who has kids. She's going through a divorce. And I asked her the other day, I was like, what are you looking for in your next partner? And she's like, I don't need a husband. I need a wife. And it was in that moment where what she was trying to say was, I need a village. I need people to come help me raise this kid. It's not necessarily a romantic love that I'm looking for. I'm obviously not looking for that because I don't have kids. Because now more and more people are choosing not to have kids, does that change the evolution of pair bonding and the future of what relationships could look like?
Yeah, there's two parts of this that are so important. I love that you bring this up. On the one hand, our mating decisions and our relationships have always responded to our ecology. It's something that anthropologists talk about all the time, that adaptations, our biology never exists in a vacuum. We're always responding to a context. And that could be relationship context. It could be our social ecology, the social place we're in. It could be our physical environment. So when we look around the world, why is it that women in the highlands of the Himalayas marry brothers? They called fraternal polyandry. Why is it that in other places we see high rates of polyamory? In other places we see long-term monogamous bonds or polygynous bonds. That's always responding to environment and ecology in the way I think about the world. And so the example you give is great because, well, where we are, whether you are looking for someone to have kids with, or maybe you're looking for a romantic partner and maybe kids come out, who knows? I mean, one of the interesting things about desires for children is when we survey people and you say, well, do you think you want kids across, particularly when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, do you think you want to reproduce? And some will say, well, I don't know. But there are all the studies that show sometimes you meet someone and you say, well, I didn't think about this, but you're someone I want to have a kid with or a dog with or a cat with or anything. I want to expand beyond just us with. So that's important because you're responding to social ecology. And the example you gave, well, it depends on what's the family network like. If you've got your parents living in the house, next door or in the house with you and raising, maybe you have that village. Maybe you're much more focused on a romantic partner for your own needs. If you don't have that, partly you want to connect. We did a study on single parents years ago with my colleague Peter Gray, and we found that single parents with young kids under the age of 2 were more they went on more dates. And at the time, it was paradoxical. And I have a baby at home, and I think, oh, how on earth do you have time for more dates when you have a young baby? I have free time. I want to sleep. But in fact, it's probably because exactly as you said, we're motivated for building that village, both for ourselves and for the kids. So I say that because I think part of our responding to social ecology is also that. What's one's individual situation? What you're looking for as a single parent is different for what you're looking for as a single with no kids. If you want someone if you're saying, I'm at a point in my life, I want to have kids, and many people don't. I'm glad you brought that up. We're seeing increasing numbers of people who are not necessarily interested in formal marriage or reproduction. What you look for in your partner is different. Do you want to be dinks? Do income, no kids? Do you want to travel? Do you want someone who could travel more? Maybe then part of what you're looking for in a partner is I want someone who's open to experience and wants to travel and wants to, I don't particularly care how good you are in the kitchen or at home or in the garden, or I want someone I could see the world with. So we're always responding to those. And I think it's what so many of the folks in our circles who are thinking about dating and connection, I think sometimes they get too focused on like, here's the formula, here's the thing to look for. And that really depends on where you are in your life and what you want. It's the same thing when we look at 18-year-old singles and 80-year-old singles. They want very different things in their relationships. And that's expected. That's the beauty of it. So part of it is, as we think about who you look for, it's also where are you in your own life and what do you want? And that shapes so much. That's why there's not one perfect formula. There's not one perfect algorithm. It's about responding to our environment.
I'm curious your take on this because, obviously relationships are evolving. Modern dating is a whole other beast that's different than dating has ever been. How do you think dating today supports or disrupts our instincts to pair bond?
I think that there's new challenges when we think about dating today. I should be asking you both this, but I think that there's, I'd love to talk about this. And I think that there's new challenges when we think about how our evolved selves play out in the modern environment. And I think we still see a lot of the same motivational systems playing out. But how we find it. So we know that we look for sensory information on a date. We want to hear their voice, see their body language, smell them, feel them, know their social network, taste them. We invoke all the bodily senses in the courtship process, as most sexually reproducing mammals do. What happens when you're on an app and you're trying to get that information? Which we know apps and websites are the most common way singles are meeting a romantic partner, at least in North America. We're starting to see that spread to other parts of the world as app rates rise. We were looking, for instance, at some data in India, really interesting example where in a very short period of time, we went from high rates of arranged marriages to higher rates of kind of what we call love marriage or love dating, where you're looking for your own partners, and a meteoric rise of app use in the last 15 years of dating apps, including for older people. So I think that it's not necessarily good or bad. It's just a very different challenge than our species evolved with. What that means is that we're still looking for things. So we're on the app and we're trying to assess someone's hygiene. We're trying to assess their health. We're trying to assess compatibility. But it's such a different way to do it than we've known how to do it and than the way that our ancestors did it. So what we then start looking for are, okay, can I see their teeth in that picture? Can I see anything in the background that tells me something about them? Which raises all sorts of things then about how we think about when we're on the mating market, when we're dating. Are we giving enough information? Not just what are we looking for? What are we trying to find? But how are we letting people find us? How are we showing up? If we're all both dating, if all of us are in the dating pool, not just, okay, I'm looking for someone who has XYZ, but did I say anything in my profile about, I'm a single who likes to travel around the world, or I'm a single who has a kid, and I think sometimes people are cautious about sharing too much information, but in fact, that gives someone a hook. It gives someone an opportunity to hook into, I should say, with something about your profile or about who you are. It's a very different way than our ancestors connected. But I also think there's a lot of opportunity. But that comes with all sorts of new and modern expectations. One about how we're processing all the data, but also how we're thinking about what we want. We just have some brand new data. It wasn't from our single study. It was from a different study we did it was funded by Match, where we asked Gen Z what they wanted in relationships. And over 80% said that they want to be in love. They want a partner that they can have a romantic, loving relationship with. But close to half, I think it was a little over 45%, said they don't think they're ready to have a relationship. So I think we also have a modern moment where particularly young people have this sense that they kind of have to keep working on themselves of this, what this readiness means. And I think that's a real challenge for so many people, particularly young people, where a relationship can be a container in which we make mistakes, we learn about who we are. But I'm hearing more and more of it. And I'm curious what you're hearing and seeing, that there's something is blocking us, particularly young people, from just jumping in.
That's really fascinating about the part about working on yourself and being ready. I mean, I was going to say, I think my take on it is that the desire to pair bond is still very much there. Yeah. I mean, clearly relationships, dating, everyone wants to talk about it. It's the center of our world in many ways. What we see happening is that people feel so discouraged by dating right now that they feel like they just want to give up. And it's like they haven't seen maybe, and I think I was here too before currently now married, but before, having a good example of a relationship and a pair bond. Like, we have situationships, we have people like flaking all the time and doing bad dating behaviors. So you don't really see a reason. Like, what is like that light at the end of the tunnel of like, this is, you know, what I'm striving for. It's more like the hypothetical that you know, see maybe of friends and family or in media, etc. But like, I think there's this disconnect today of like, is this even worth it because it feels so unattainable?
I totally agree with you. And we asked in our single study one year about where people were getting their sources of, like, what are your role models for relationships? And not that many people, particularly young people, not many were using family, like their parents or their aunts or their uncles or their best friends. They were saying influencers or what I see on social media.
Sad. That's really sad.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
TikTok.
I mean, we're also like fallout of divorce generations and stuff. So I definitely see that also.
Yeah. And the problem with exactly a TikTok or an Instagram relationship is, did you see how they negotiate conflict?
You only see the eyes.
How they take care of each other when they're sick. You only see a certain element. And that's not, when we think about pair bonds, part of it is having that person who's there to catch you when you fall, to that you can take risks, you can experiment, you can see the world. But also that care piece is there, that there's someone to help. I think so much that pair bonds really evolved for us to have someone to weather the storms of life with over the long haul. And that part you can't see if you're just sort of taking clips of what you think. And that part you also don't learn on first dates. I'm a huge advocate of, as you both know, because I talk about it in the book, I'm a big advocate of second dates and third dates. And you don't know. The number one thing we see singles want in a date in our data year over year is someone you can trust and confide in. Same for men and women, for the young and the old. We want a partner we can trust and confide in. You don't learn that just from an app profile, and you don't really learn that from a first date. It takes time.
Let's hold that thought because we have a quick message from our sponsors.
IPVanish protects every device you own. Your phone, your laptop, your smart TV. If it connects to the internet, it should be protected. IPVanish encrypts your connection and masks your IP address, helping keep your browsing private at home and on public Wi-Fi. And with no device limits, one account covers everything. Stream with added privacy. Browse securely. Connect with confidence. Online protection made simple. Right now, save 83% off the 2-year plan. Get started today at ipvanish.com/audio and take control of your privacy with IPVanish.
The question I always have, though, right, every day I think about this, are we actually progressing or are we straying? And I'm asking this because I look at, we look at the patterns of what's happening right now. Matchmaking is making a comeback. App dating is decreasing. When you ask Gen Z what they want, they do want relationships, they want marriage. It's almost like we went through several decades of trying to be progressive and looking at non-traditional relationships, but we've actually just kind of reverted back and said, no, these traditional relationships are what we want. And I forwarded these stats to Julie the other day, looking at all the reality dating shows and the success rate after the shows are over. And the show with the highest success rate was 90 Day Fiancé. And the lowest success rate were the ones where you get to pick who you want to marry. You go through like the whole courting process. And I just find that so fascinating that when you have less choices, but you're more committed, those shows had a higher success rate. So that goes back to my question. Do you actually think we're progressing and redefining the future relationships? Or we're just all going to come back one day and say, actually, the old way of doing it is the right way. It's what I want.
Yeah, I think a bit of both is my take on it. And that we are in a moment where we have more choice than ever before. We have more opportunity than ever before. We could get on an app and find someone of the same hobbies. You're looking for a tennis partner. That's what I was looking for a long time, right? If you're looking for someone, but then I married someone who's a golfer, and I don't play golf, and she doesn't play tennis, and we're happy, but we didn't get what we were looking for. And right, so if you're looking for someone a hobby, someone of the same religion, someone of the same kink, someone of the same sexual minority group, we are more able to do that than ever before in human history. That opportunity is there. But exactly, then where do those opportunities take us? Maybe you try everything, right? But is that really what you were looking for? On the one hand, I think that's great. I think that's wonderful, particularly for certain groups. In our multinational data, for instance, in places of the world that have less gender egalitarianism, women find the apps safer and easier to use because they're addressing those issues in certain corners of the world. Well, everywhere, really, but in certain places worse than others. LGBTQ people find that the apps are easier. So there's all sorts of nuances there. Okay, but you asked a much bigger question about like where are we really going with all of this, and is it for the better? So I think that part is for the better, that we have more choice than ever before. I think the problem with that choice and what research studies show is that it's overwhelming for the human brain. Yeah. And one of my favorite studies that I wrote about was if I'm remembering the numbers exactly now, it was an experimental design where people had 24 dating profiles versus 6 dating profiles. And then they followed up with them. And I think it was 2 weeks out in the study, if I'm remembering the details correctly. Those with only 6 to choose from were happier with their decision than those with 24 options. So we have this idea that more options are better. But when you have more options, you then start to say, well, what about that other one?
Right.
What about, like, oh, this person I met is really great, but I could have been playing tennis with you. Or what if I had done, this? Or I could have been traveling with Julie. I could have been. So you start looking at these options and you're in this world of like, well, did I really make the right choice? If you have a smaller number, you hone in and you focus. Now, relationship scientists love to say we get focused on this idea that the grass is greener, that on the other side, that there were all these options. But really, the grass is greenest where you water it.
Right.
So how do we invest in the person in front of us? And when you have too many options, you can be lost in that. The other thing about the dating shows that I think is interesting about 90 Day Fiancé is the 90-day part. So I think of one of the challenges with a lot of the dating shows is they're too rushed. Like I think that some of them, if you just had more time to get to know people, if you're not racing this clock that in 30 days do you actually want to get married, or 60 days do you want to get married, that clock, that's the part that doesn't align with Western norms about dating, right? That we're doing this in a country where so few people get married after a month or 3 months. You can have an arranged relationship, you can have an experiment, but this idea that you put this pressure on. Now, of course, that doesn't, I remember talking to one of the producers of one of these shows once, and I was like, I know this doesn't make good TV. And they're like, no, it doesn't. We can't have like a 2-year long show. And I was like, but that would be better for the science of connecting them. But my favorite, one of my favorite dating shows. Yeah. I know. They were like, no one will watch this. You're a bad producer. And I was like, I know, but
needs to be 6 weeks or bust. Yeah.
Yes.
One of my favorite dating shows is, not the US, but I'll have to share it, is the Singles Inferno, which is this Korean dating show.
Yeah.
I love it. And I love it because it's a smaller group and they do these little game competitions, but they do them as a group. So they really get to know each other. So as someone who thinks about the social dynamics of like, could this really work? I watch that one religiously because I really think that there's something interesting about that design, that there's relatively small group. They get to go on these little dates and really get to know each other. But I'm not sure that they're particularly successful either.
So it's actually interesting. Earlier you said like that most of the people get their kind of like model for love nowadays from influencers and people online and in the media. And I think actually like over COVID, right? Remember there was that period where everyone was in their home just using TikTok for the first time. And there was a lot of couples doing stuff together because that's the only person you could see, right? Whoever was in your home with you. And there was this light bulb shift for me. This sounds so dumb, but I'll say it anyways. There was a shift that I was like, oh, these people are just like friends having fun, goofing around together. This isn't the view of relationships I've had before. Like you think about like more of the dating shows, or like I need to be on for the date and I need to be attractive and flirty and like all of the stuff that goes with dating, not just like I'm going to live my life with another human being. And there was something that was actually very beautiful to me about that. And I was like, I want that. Like, I want someone that I'm not like having these chasing dynamics and wondering when they're going to text. And I just want someone I live my life with. And sounds stupid coming from TikTok, but like it was a shift. And, now that I'm like with my husband, our relationship was so different than anything I'd experienced because it did feel like just like a best friend that I'm attracted to, that I have chemistry with, but like I'm living my life with a best friend. I guess where I'm going with this is like, how do you think people can see more of the benefits of like a relationship and like beyond just like the romantic whisk you away on a date type of feeling that we've been fed?
Yeah. And I think that's so true in so many ways. And I'm not I don't like the idea that relationships are work or hard work. And some of my colleagues disagree with me because they know I'm a bit of a hardliner on this. I'm like, relationships should not be hard work. And when I first started saying that when I was still single in some of our studies, and one of my married colleagues was like, you just wait. And like, if you ever get married, you'll have a decision. But I still also don't think they should be hard work. I think they take compromise, they take negotiation, but they don't have to be hard work. But part of what we found in the pandemic in particular, back to this idea that relationships, that pair bonds allow us to weather uncertainty in the long haul in our lives. In some ways, the pandemic was a test of that. This was this enormous uncertainty. A lot of us were afraid. We were freaked out. The economy wasn't good. People were dying. I mean, really having a partner that you could weather that with, in some ways, was the whole purpose of the evolutionary story of why we form these bonds. And in fact, we did a series of studies here at the Kinsey Institute on relationships during the pandemic. And what we found is most marriages, close to 85% of marriages, did better during the pandemic. Now, was there a lot going on financially, socially, health-wise? Were there arguments? Were you seeing too much of each other? Sure. It also was you were weathering an extraordinary moment in human history together. Now, there were also effects on people's sexual lives. We found decreases in sexual frequency in our study, including masturbatory behavior. So people were just not interested, which told us that sexual desire had decreased. People were just, and I think of that in terms of with all the stress that was happening, that's not really conducive to eroticism. But even though sexual frequency had decreased, 1 in 5 in our sample had tried something new sexually. And so they were also experimenting, taking risks. Although months later, I interviewed one couple, and this woman said, my husband and I started having shower sex during the pandemic. And I said, that fits our data. You're experimenting. You're trying something new. And she said, well, we were, but it was really because it was the only time we had 5 minutes away from the kids. We would take a shower. So they would shower together so that they could kind of get a little bit of time to themselves. So it was invention. It was invention of necessity.
I love that.
I loved it. I thought it was great. I was like, this is good. Still kind of works for my theory. And we also found in another study that 1 in 4 singles started having sex with a non-romantic roommate during the pandemic.
Interesting.
Because
we've heard that.
You brought up friends, like being friends. And for many people, you turn to your roommates and say, we're great friends. That's why we live together. And sometimes we put these blocks about, well, that's not a romantic partner. That's not one I can date, because we put people in these buckets. But the pandemic was this moment that you thought, like, why have we never? We can live together. We like each other. Maybe we can find that chemistry and that romantic piece if we allow ourselves to think about it.
That's interesting because you always hear about like all the divorces during that time. You don't really hear about the increase of partnership and appreciating it.
Yeah, exactly. And early on, there was a lot of thoughts about it. I remember talking to a few journalists, like, do you think everyone's going to get divorced in 6 months? And I said, I don't know. It depends on how intense the stress is. If it really wears, because there's so much fear that came with it. But what we really saw were people leaning into their relationships and their social connections, and in some ways connecting with friends that, a lot of us had to slow down in some ways. Not everyone. I mean, if you're a hospital worker, you weren't slowing down, but it was a moment that we were really leaning into thinking about, like, who have I not talked to and who have I not connected with? And I think that we've seen since that moment changes in dating. Like early in my career, I wrote a lot about hookup culture. That's radically changed in the last few years.
Yes.
And since the pandemic, I think the pandemic did give this like brief hope of like putting connection at the forefront in dating, but then everyone went back to their old ways after. And I actually think that's been part of the decline of dating in the last couple years, because I feel like the negativity around dating has actually skyrocketed in the last even like 2 years. Like it's been like an increase from before. So it's almost like we got this glimpse of more connection and then it like went away.
I think part of it is something you both write about and talk about. I mean, I think a lot of it is also the skills, like, how do you date? How are you showing up to be of interest to people? What do you do on a first date? That there's this real sense of, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's appropriate. I don't know what's safe or fun, at least folks we're surveying in our studies and then on a college campus, there just feels like people feel lost. They need a guide on how to do dating and what the goal is. And as I said, I'll often say, like, think about your first 2 dates, not just one. Unless you really skeeved out or your nervous system says I'm not safe, then listen to that and get out. But part of dating is getting to know someone. It takes a little bit of time.
There is a parallel between COVID and 90 Day Fiancé. Bear with me. I think it's we're bring it full circle. It's the commitment up front. It's the we're going to do this together. It's the we're roommates, so let's just do this. Like, let's try this. Let's make this work. And I think that's why so many relationships did work out very well during COVID. I had a relationship like that because we turned to each other. We're like, I guess we're going to move in. I guess we're doing this and we're going to commit to each other. So the question then for me is, do you think a commitment is necessary for successful pair bonding, or is pair bonding the exploratory phase to a commitment?
Yeah. And that early signaling early on is helpful. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that people who do online dating and app dating have a higher quote unquote success rate of forming a relationship than if you're meeting someone in a bar or club or through friends. And part of it is it's because you're in the mode of, once you download your profile and set it up, you're saying, I'm looking for a partner. And if you walk into a bar tonight and you maybe meet someone, were you really in that? You're like, I was just looking for, a light dinner and I met someone. And so what's the mindset of what you're looking for? And it causes a statistical bias because it's also, you're kind of capturing a group of people really actively looking. So when I think of pair bonding and commitment, I think that a part of when we form those intense bonds, when we really start to connect with someone, particularly that back to this idea of someone you can trust and confide in, we want to know they're there. And it's so easy in today's world to just really not be clear about that and say, well, okay, I'm falling in love with you. I feel connected to you. But what does that mean? Does that mean, are you going to be here when I wake up? Are you going to be here in 6 months? Are you going to be here when I'm sick? And commitment, whether commitment means talking about what are we doing? Are we just hanging out? Is this a relationship? Are we boyfriend, girlfriend? What are our goals? Are we exclusive? All of that. And that can take all sorts of different forms for different people. And maybe you say, well, commitment means that we're going to be honest with each other, but I'm also going to, see other people. And maybe you have an open relationship. It could take all these different forms. But commitment's about having that conversation and being clear about what is this? What are we doing? What does this mean? And that, particularly for young people, a lot of them go through, and when I say young people, I mean Gen Z, somewhat millennials, that we see these long periods of like hanging out for 3, 6, 9 months. And you're like, well, we're kind of a thing, but don't give it a label. And, it's maybe not exclusive. Also has implications for health and sexually transmitted infections, because often one person assumes like, well, we're really serious now, right? But we never had the conversation about commitment or exclusivity. Yeah. And I think that can take a lot of different forms, but we start to want that. And in fact, that's true of other species that form pair bonds. When we look at birds, about 90% of bird species pair bond, at least for a mating season. They get extremely territorial and they mate guard their partners. So a neighbor comes by and tries to mate with your partner, they often will fight to the death to try and stop that. And so those pair bonds come with this, what we call mate guarding or jealousy we'll talk about in humans, because you kind of really want to know what are the contours of what we're doing. That feeling of love, that feeling of wanting to be around someone. Doesn't mean you can't be open to having some type of open relationship or situationship, but you really have to work through that together in the best case.
So I'm curious, this could lead into your views on polyamory, because I thought that was really interesting in your book, like just how you had a lot of strong opinions on the topic. And I see it because it's like, pair bonding is 2, polyamory is more than 2. What's your take on polyamory? Like, can you form the same multiple pair bonds, or what happens when the jealousy seeps in, or is there a way not to have jealousy come in? Like, what's your take?
Yeah. And this is, in some ways, as someone who studies these pair bond relationships and thinks about the evolution of them, how do you make sense of the reality that there are lots of people who have different relationship structures? And what's interesting about it is that relationship scientists talk about romantic love or pair bonding. We use expressions like psychologists define love as focused attention, intrusive thought, obsessive thinking. pretty hard to have that with more than one person at a time. How do we break down these different pieces? Also, back to what anthropologists see when they look around the world, we see relationship structure in all sorts of different ways. There are plenty of societies that have polygynous marriage systems of some sort. What I try to do, when I look at all these different relationship structures, I still see this thread of pair bonds, of people form intense relationships, often one at a time. That doesn't mean they're not successive. So I use an example in The Intimate Animal of these anthropologists, Barry and Bonnie Hewlett, who work with Central African communities, the Aka and the Ngunda. They have an example where they interview a man in one of their articles who said, well, I love my first wife the most, but we can't have kids. She's unable to have kids, so I remarried. I have a new wife, and we're trying to have kids. They have a polygynous marriage system in this community. But my first wife is the one who really understands me and who I share kind of I rely on emotionally. And now that's all in a particular cultural context where multi-marriage is expected and there's multiple wives, and there's examples where women take multiple husbands. There's examples where what we call partible paternity. When we look around the world, there's all sorts of ways people structure relationships differently. But at its core, what I see are still patterns of pair bond relationships. And I think when we look at what researchers sometimes call consensual non-monogamy, used to be called ethical non-monogamy, and then researchers said, whose ethics is it? Let's call it consensual non-monogamy. Now researchers are saying, well, it's consent of both parties is consenting. Let's call it negotiated non-monogamy, or we could call it different terms about how we think about what these are. But what we might think of as open relationships. I'm putting a pin in polyamory for 1 second. I'm going to come back to that because it is functionally different. So when we think about open relationships in that sense, often it's fairly clear that you often have an arrangement, here's my pair bond partner, and maybe we have sex with other people. It's okay when you're traveling and I don't see it, or it's okay as long as you use protection, or or maybe we only play together and we have threesomes, and but sometimes it's called monogamish, right? We're swingers. There's often some structure of what that looks like for the most part. And there's still rules. So you can be in a negotiated non-monogamy relationship, but still have infidelity, because there's still infidelity at its core is a betrayal. And there's often some kind of rule. Maybe, okay, we have an open relationship, but it can't be one of our friends, or you can't see the person more than once. And it turns out all over the world, people have rules around it. The challenging piece that you brought up is polyamory, the challenging theoretically, because polyamory is plural love by definition, poly, many, amory, love. That is something different than an open sexual relationship. Because in an open sexual relationship, you say, okay, I have my pair bond, that lever we talked about at the top of the hour, and then I also have this desire for sexual novelty. There's a few ways that could play out. I have the pair bond. I have such a desire for novelty, I accidentally cheat. I have infidelity. Most people don't want that. Okay, I have the pair bond and I'm just always looking for something else and I don't get it. And then I'm frustrated in our relationship. Or I have the pair bond, we open our relationship, we negotiate, we agree to what it looks like, I have sex with other people, then I feel connection, I feel sexual novelty. Or what I think in the best case for many people, particularly in the West, is we have the pair bond, I take this desire for sexual novelty, I pull that desire into our relationship, and you and I do things with each other that are exciting and that give us that sense of novelty. This is what we see in couples who have long-term passion, couples that are together 30 years and still have passion. What do they do to kind of invoke that feeling of novelty in their own relationship instead of being pulled outside for it? Mm-hmm. I still haven't answered your question. I'm circling there. And so in polyamory, what we see is trying to kind of reimagine that structure and say, okay, I have the desire for connection, but why focus just on one person? And I could have those connections with multiple people. But once we look under the hood, when we look a little bit further, we're seeing a separation of a lot of functions in a relationship. So it's not, I think people assume that in polyamory that, okay, you have two partners and you love them the same and you're both romantically and sexually. Often what you see is really, I have one partner that I rely on more for A and one that I rely on more for B. So you're finding complements in a relationship, at least in those polyamorous couples that have long-term satisfaction. I don't want to use the word success because who knows what do we mean by success, but have long-term satisfaction, that they're breaking up what they want in a relationship. That does work for some people. In our data, we found about 21% of people have at some point had an open relationship, at some point in their life. How many people are actively in one? Less than 5%, according to most of the studies. That tells us that many people try these different dynamics, but they're not necessarily sustainable in the long haul. And I have a pet theory that I write about, that I actually think that for some folks who engage in polyamory long term, that the way that their brain is processing relationships is different. Now, all of our brains are a little bit different, but I think many people really struggle with the notion and, in fact, the capacity to manage multiple love bonds at once, especially when we're talking about focused attention, intrusive thought, obsessive thinking. But then, I know people, whether they're colleagues or friends or people I've interviewed, that they have multiple relationships and it works out perfectly. Like, we have to acknowledge they exist. I think that the way they're processing those relationships is different than the majority of the population. And I think that there's a subset that they just want more. And is the answer 2 or 3 or 4? I mean, at some point you run out of hours in the day, but it's having multiple of those relationships. What satiation means is different. And in fact, people do something very similar with food. In fact, how we process food and how we process when we're full, people vary quite a lot with. And some people feel full from 1 apple, some want 2, some want 3. It's not necessarily about body size. It's about really how the brain is processing the information coming in.
I love that. So then that brings us to infidelity, because you touched upon this as well. Is there a universal reason for infidelity then? Do you think it's really because the pair bond is broken, or some aspects of the pair bond is broken?
No, I don't think there is. And I think this is one of the myths that can really be damaging to people and relationships. In one of our studies, we looked at what are the motivations for infidelity. Well, I did one study that looked at genetic motivations on a gene, DRT4, dopamine receptor gene. So there's some people who have different genetic predisposition to engage in infidelity. It doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily. We found people with a particular variant of the gene were 50% more likely to engage in infidelity. Plenty of people with it never did. Plenty of people without it still did. Our genes are not destiny. We're not prisoners of our biology. But we also did a study on motivations with my colleague Dylan Selterman, social psychologist, where we looked and we found 8 different motivations that people, using a statistical method to look at what are the most popular ones after these huge surveys. 8 motivations people reported for past experiences of infidelity. And what we find is that the idea that all infidelity happens because there's a problem in a relationship, there's a problem in a pair bond, that's what we call the deficit model of infidelity. That's what a lot of particularly therapists often think about. That doesn't line up that well with what we see in the data. What we see is that, yes, when there's problems in relationships, maybe infidelity happens. Sometimes it happens, it's just about sex. It's not necessarily about love. You could say, well, I love my partner, but I'm looking for that sexual novelty and I'm not getting it in my relationship. Sometimes you do because you're looking for your next partner and you say, well, I'm looking for my exit ramp of this relationship. Sometimes it's because there is a deficit in the relationship, but that doesn't characterize the majority of it. And in fact, one of the things that years of studying monogamy and non-monogamy and infidelity that I see, and then I've really come to appreciate that a whole lot of infidelity is putting yourself in a position that makes it too easy. So if we go back to this idea that we have a mechanism for social monogamy and a mechanism for sexual variety, that part of infidelity is we have that desire. So if you don't want to engage in infidelity, because it can be so devastating to a relationship. And I think actually we're in the process of doing a study now. I think a lot of infidelity, people avoid it because they don't want to hurt their partners. So if you're in an open relationship, those rules are different. But a lot of it is, are you in a position? A lot of it is associated with alcohol and drugs. In one study of men who are in couples therapy for infidelity, 2/3 said, I'm not that kind of guy. I never thought this would have happened. And I actually think that there's something we can learn there. I don't think they're just maybe some of them are. I don't think most of them are just making that up. The reality is many people don't walk around and look at their partners and say, I'm going to probably cheat on you one day. A lot of it is situational. Are you someplace? So, for instance, I travel a ton for work. And how you manage that in a relationship is, I often will sit in a hotel bar having dinner. And how you manage that with how you're talking to other people in the hotel or in the bar. Does your partner know where you are? It's in some ways, it's too easy to slip into infidelity. But if you're aware of that and you say, okay, how am I going to manage this in my relationship? Because I don't want to damage my relationship for any number of reasons. But how do I manage then being in situations and spaces that you can be careful, right? So if you're sitting at the hotel bar and you're slugging back a few drinks and you're talking to people who are there with you, and then the talking turns into flirting and there's a room just right upstairs, it can become too easy. And how many of us have been traveling and seen someone on a trip and say, I can see what's going on over there across the hotel bar. So I think that a lot of infidelity is also about acknowledging what we want in our relationships. And maybe you do want that and that makes it easier, but acknowledging what we want in our relationships and then how we manage it. And the idea that it's all about problems in our relationship, I think is a myth that can do a lot of damage. And it can also prevent healing from when infidelity does occur. Many of us walk around and say, well, if there's ever infidelity, I'm out. This relationship is over. But then in practice, if you're in a long-term relationship with someone and you love them, or you have a house, or you have kids, and then infidelity happens, it turns out a majority of people don't just walk away. They try to figure out getting over the indiscretion, getting over the violation of trust.
I want to dive into this even more, but before we do, let's take a quick break to hear from our partners.
We talk a lot on Dateable about being present in dating, but let's be real. That's hard when your phone is basically a third wheel. Enter Brick. Brick is a simple device that helps you put your phone down when you actually want to be in the moment. You just pair your phone to Brick and it locks you out of distracting apps, and suddenly you're not doom scrolling while your date is telling a story about their childhood dog. Whether you're on a first date, having a real conversation, or just trying to stop checking your phone every 30 seconds, Brick creates boundaries with your tech without asking you to delete everything or go full digital detox. Dating is about connection, not notifications. So if you want to be more present and honestly more attractive, check out Brick. Go to getbrick.app/dateable to get 10% off. That's getbrick.app/DATEABLE to get 10% off.
So you talk about managing it, right? So of course there's the person that goes to the hotel bar and sees someone hot and goes for it. And then there's the other that eats their food and minds their own business. Is it that you're more bonded, or your DNA is like set to be more faithful? Or like, what is the reason why one goes one direction and one goes the other?
I think there's a whole host of reasons. Maybe you had too many drinks and you damped down your executive functioning, or maybe you're more risk-taking. Maybe you just got in an argument with your partner. I think there's all sorts of reasons that the evidence would say that could happen. The challenge, I think, is if you're in a long-term relationship, how you think of what is it that you really want and what are the consequences of those next behaviors. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit in a corner and not talk to anyone, but also how do you, like, I'll often hear people say, well, I don't share my location with my partner because it's invasive and that's too much. And that okay, there's an argument to be made there. But then also, why else would you do it? Maybe it's because of, I've talked to couples who one commutes and they say, well, I like to know if they left the office because they're driving for an hour. I don't want to text them, or I know they make calls in the car. There's all sorts of reasons that we do things that it's easy to sometimes say, well, that feels controlling. Do I really need to tell my partner what I'm doing when I'm traveling for work and I'm at a hotel bar? I'm independent. That's controlling. That's one way to approach a relationship. But the other is to invite your partner in and say, I FaceTime them from the hotel bar with my earbuds, or take a picture of what you're eating. Or there are so many opportunities for strain on our relationships. And sure, we could walk around saying, I'm independent, I don't want to be controlled. But a relationship is all about having a partner, a co-pilot, and letting them into your world. And when we put ourselves in a position that says, like, no, I am independent, that is a real challenge for a relationship. And it welcomes so many other challenges. It welcomes so many opportunities for indiscretions that are a little too easy. It doesn't mean that I think we need to control and surveil our partners all the time. That's not what I'm saying. I want to be careful to make it clear that's not what I'm saying. But if we have a desire to be in long-term relationships, I do think it takes management to really think about how do you let someone else be in and be a part of, even if you're not physically in the same space. And if you don't want that, or you're unwilling to have that, then I think there's a bigger question of maybe, what are you really looking for? Do you really want a partner, or do you just want a nanny? What is it that you actually want in your life? Do you want someone to take care of you? Or do you want a love relationship? That takes mutual respect.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's someone that their priority is upholding a relationship, and that's going to impact if they act or not. I know you also talk about empathy and that finding that people that have more empathy tend to cheat less. Is that correct? Or how would you describe it? Yeah.
Yes, it's exactly right. And I do think, and people actually with higher empathy are also better lovers. They're a little bit more focused on your reactions, your pleasure. Your empathetic people are great to have in relationships for all sorts of reasons, both in and out of the bedroom. And this idea, I think the empathy piece for me is very much about, okay, you could be in a situation where it's easy or not easy to engage in infidelity, but what are the consequences? And one of the things we're looking at in this new study, well, will I blow up my relationship? Will I hurt my partner? What if there's a pregnancy? What if I get a sexually transmitted infection? And part of empathy is going through those consequences. And what are the impacts on me, on the impacts on my partner? What are the impacts on our relationship? And I think that's important because in all these different pieces, whether we're thinking about chemistry or love or sex or infidelity, that when we think of our relationships, if we can think of these three parts, this is a theme I have in a couple of different chapters in The Intimate Animal, is that there's me, there's you, and there's us. And that there's always three entities in our relationship. Then we start to see these things a little bit differently. Because infidelity, a betrayal, it damages not just you, but it also damages us. It has a lot of impacts on the relationship in all sorts of ways, and often can end a relationship, and how to navigate that.
I'm going to ask you a really out of this world kind of question. Let's just get wild.
Let's do
it. What do you think about this idea of outsourcing infidelity in some way? So, for example, if you know that you have this desire for sexual variety, then fine, let's buy you sex, Or if we want to get really crazy, eventually when we have robots take over to do chores or whatnot, we outsource that to the robot so that we still keep our intimacy, our pair bond, our connection. And now I know that you are getting your sexual variety needs met elsewhere by something that we're paying for or outsourcing.
Yeah, and I think particularly, and when sexologists talk about desire discrepancy in couples, so sometimes there's one partner that has much more desire and interest in that novelty, and that, how do you find ways of managing that? And you say, well, we can pull some of it into our relationship, but then there's this whole other piece that can be a challenge in a couple dynamic. They're increasingly, particularly with technologies, whether they're chatbots and these sort of AI boyfriend girlfriends, whether they're sex toys, whether there's full sex dolls, which in some ways are, when I used to teach the sexuality class, I used to ask my students, what's the difference between a vibrator and a sex toy? They would just sort of start debating it. And I always liked it. And then finally someone would say, well, it's 100 pounds and 5 feet tall. Isn't that the kind of make it like it has a face? Doesn't that make it, qualitatively differently? I'm like, bingo.
Vibrator doesn't have a face.
And these technologies are changing. There's now brothels that have sex dolls in them and sex toys in them. And you can also go to a legal brothel with people. I think that's something that a couple, I don't think there's a good answer for everyone, but for couples, particularly if you're dealing with desire discrepancy, where maybe that's because you really start to feel the tension of it. The challenge is often jealousy that we see in our studies that in quite a high number of people, I think we found that 2/3 of people, if you had sex with a robot, would consider it infidelity, if I'm remembering correctly.
2/3 of people? Really?
Yeah. So how you negotiate that with a relationship about what are the borders of what's acceptable or not? There are some people who say they get upset if the idea that their partner masturbated, without them. And as couples, how do you negotiate? What are those borders? But I think actually it's a great opportunity to use these technologies when we say, okay, here are the borders of what I think are infidelity and not, and here's what's acceptable to me. And with the AI stuff, though, the chatbots, particularly the erotic chatbots and the intimate bots, increasingly people are showing concern. More people are starting to use them, but increasingly people are showing concern of well, that feels like it feels too advanced. As opposed to, and even the dolls. It's not, 20 years ago we talked about blow-up dolls, but now the dolls they have skin that feels like human flesh. They have eyes that open and close. They have hair you can change. It starts getting more realistic. Then it starts to feel, for a lot of people, almost like infidelity because it feels like you're with a person. Or is it like a gateway and you started doing this and then you start.
Right.
I think it's if you found out your partner was doing this and you guys hadn't had a conversation about it, I would feel like there's there's something you're hiding. There's some the level of betrayal is there. So I could see the way it's set up probably indicates if you're in that 2/3 or the 1/3. And most people probably aren't having open, honest conversations about it. They're just doing it.
For sure.
Yeah.
But I definitely, for the record, I much rather my partner have sex with a robot than a real person.
But a blow-up doll?
That's my preference.
I don't know.
It raises all sorts of questions. But does it matter to you if the partner looks like you or doesn't look like you?
Oh my God. There's a lot of, that's interesting.
Right? Okay.
Whoa.
Okay. On a different topic.
Please.
You actually.
How do we have a different topic after that?
You said something interesting earlier about some people are just too independent. You also talked about genes for being predisposition more to infidelity. Are there some people that just aren't cut out to pair bond? Are there some people that just it's not in the cards for them, and instead of forcing it, it's better to just live a solo life?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of work on singlehood and a single life and living solo, which for many years faced a lot of discrimination, still does, what we call singleism. sociologists have written about, and how we judge people who are single in all sorts of ways, not just in terms of tax codes, but also socially.
Yep.
And if you're single too long, you have this double barrel of stigma that you face. On the one hand, people say, well, you're single because you don't want it. Why are you not doing this normative thing? Why aren't you forming a relationship? It must be something with you that you don't want it that badly. Or that's the one barrel. The other is you're single because people don't want to be in a relationship with you. So what do I not really know about you that makes you so challenging?
You're right.
So you have this double barrel of social stigma that happens. And a number of studies have sort of teased that out for long-term singlehood. But we do know that there are some people who very much enjoy singlehood, and they can get a lot of the social support and connection that they need, sometimes even the sexual life that they need, from hookups, from friends, from family members, on the social side, not the sexual side. But you can kind of have...
Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah.
That's syntax of my sentence. So we know that there are a lot of people who find social support and connection in other ways, and they have pretty high rates of happiness, all things considered. We also have to know, funny, I was just talking this morning to my colleague, Dr. Jessica Hilley, who's written a lot about asexuality, but also asexuality, the absence of interest in sexual activity, but then aromanticism is something we don't talk as much about. Yeah. But there are some people who, and they sometimes can be independent. So there are some people who are asexual but still really want a relationship.
Right.
And then there are some people who are aromantic, don't have any interest in pair bonding, but they still want a sex life. So we have to acknowledge that also, that variation that exists. And in some cases, those are also associated with neurodiversity. So we see some relationships, for instance, between asexuality and autism spectrum, which is itself about how we connect socially, how the brain thinks about social behavior. So lots of variation there. Some more maybe on the clinical side, some about what we understand about the brain and how we process social relationships, sexual desire, sociality, and then others just human variation. And then some of it is also contextual. So in some of our studies of older people in particular, older singles and their romantic and sexual life, some will say, well, I'm really just looking for a companion. I'm looking for a partner. Maybe I don't want the sex piece, but if I didn't find a companion, maybe I've got a great group of friends and that's sort of working for me.
So could I add a follow-on question? Because I think that's where I was, like, that's what I'm curious about what you just said of like, I have a great group of friends. I have all this stuff in my life. And I think for years, I felt that way. Like I was pretty single, clearly had some relationships come and gone, but they weren't like the real, like in-depth pair bond. And I was like, you know what? I don't need to find someone. I have enough connection in my life. I have great friends and family, etc. But the thing is that happens is that everyone is kind of living their lives independently. Yeah. Like when you have friends, right? You're not like building collectively. And since now having a partner that I have a pair bond with, I can see the difference like very clearly of just like, this is the person that's there through everything. And like you talk about in your book, like I install this security system, not just for my safety, but like for my partner because I'm like enmeshed with them. And you just don't get this with like friends and family to the same level, maybe like a parent to child, but I feel like there's very few other bonds that have that same level of like, we're in it together. How do you, I guess like a two-part question, like is your life just as complete without that? Or are there ways to build that with someone that's not a romantic partner where you're like in it together?
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes psychologists talk about the inclusion of other and self, and we think of like these two circles that start to overlap with each other. And many people want that, but there's a lot of variation. So the same with what we call limerence, that early on, those feelings of romantic love and butterflies in your stomach and you can't find your words and you sweat when you see the person. Not everyone actually experiences that. There's variation in how we experience. So when we talk about that intoxicating feeling of first blush love, it's not all people experience it that way. Some feel deep sense of safety and they actually don't have that almost anxiety experience when they're falling in love. So there's variation on that piece. I agree with you. Personally, I have this idea that someone who is there to weather storms with, that we can support each other. And also we know that in relationships, it's not just, I know that there's someone there to take care of me, is I want to take care of you. I think that's the big challenge with all this AI stuff, technology, these chatbots. It's like, do I really think I'm making my chatbot's life better? You know, like I want to wake up and make you breakfast before you come down. And I want to feel like I'm contributing to a better experience for my partner. Some people don't want that. So there are some people when we look at singles who say like, yeah, I like going on dates and I like having sex. I don't want someone enmeshed. I don't want an inclusion of another in my life and myself. And I think the challenge is like, when someone can see that and accept that, and when we have this idea of here's what dating looks like, here's what comes next, but there is a subset of people who are saying like, well, I like the dates, I like the sex, I like being around people, but I want my independence. I had a friend who was, it's not a secret, it was written about in the New York Times, my colleague, the late Dr. Helen Fisher, her and her husband famously lived apart. Yeah. They had, they had separate apartments in New York, and they did, 3 nights, 2 nights, 3 nights. But they also they met later in life. So they had whole routines of their lifestyle, of friends and theater, opera tickets, and that they did things, and they had this way of life that they structured. They lived together apart is what it's called. Mm-hmm. So I think different people structure that in different ways. Now, you need a certain amount of resources to be able to do that. Not everyone can afford to have 2 apartments in New York City that you for your relationship, right? And that there's all those sorts of things that also to think about, how we structure that there is some variation. But for the most part, most people who form these bonds, we do want someone who we feel like they're part of our life, that we can have that deep sense of trust and confide in. They're there. You could say maybe we have a few thousand friends on social media. How many are going to be able to take you to the hospital in the morning if something happens? How many are there to really talk through your next job promotion, to really talk through what's keeping you awake at night? That's what a lot of us want in our romantic relationships. And that can be a challenge to get. Sometimes you have elements of it in your best friends, of your family relationships, but often different. And often they have their own other relationships. I mean, if you have it with a best friend that you just have that with each other, you're basically in a relationship with each other.
Yeah, I guess that's the question is like, do you need the one person? Or if you're able to pull, I have a lot of close friends that I could go to the hospital for and like do things for, but I see like they all like also have their own lives. And for me, this is just for me, other people might feel different. I want that one person that I can be there for, and they are there for me 100% above everything else. Is that necessary, or can you kind of like cherry pick, or does it come back to like your own way of doing things?
Yeah. And I think that, and in fact, what you describe is the ideal case. We have, when we think about psychological loneliness, part of the issue is many people have a lot of really loose ties. So we want a circle of, having a lot of loose ties is great. You can sort of say like, does anyone have a gardener? And you can ask your 3,000 friends. Great. But you also want the smaller number of folks you have deeper relationships with. But then having 1 or 2 people, typically romantic partners or family that you really can rely on, that kind of gives you this best combination. I know I'm dancing around the necessity piece of it. And I think the reason being is it really depends. It really depends on what it is that you want. What are the outcomes that you want? When we use a word like necessity, the question for me is suddenly, okay, are we measuring satisfaction? Are we measuring happiness? Are we measuring health? There's a different answer for those depending on what those structures look like. We do know that long-term relationships, pair bond relationships, are associated with better psychological health, lower rates of loneliness, better physical health, because a lot of what we understand about pair bonds and romantic love tied to the oxytocin system actually helps our immune system. So you have better physical health. And also, you're able to navigate the social world in all sorts of ways. We do have this mononormative way that many of us live. So I think it really depends on what our goals are in all sorts of ways.
Do you think then our need for pair bonding is directly correlated to our access to resources? For example, a lot of people move in together because it's cheaper to live together and share those resources. But as what I've seen with many of my friends who have more and more resources, they're like, well, if I'm in the hospital, I don't need someone to be there. I'm just going to hire someone to come take care of me. Or I don't need someone to do this because I have the resources to hire someone. Do you think that could somewhat directly correlate to our need for pair bonding?
Yeah, I think there's challenges with that too, even if you have the resources where you say, I mean, I'm thinking of I don't want to be a spoiler, but if anyone watched this season of Bridgerton, but sometimes you can think of, you can have staff or you could have someone that you pay, and this distinction of like, well, they're like family. And it's like, well, are they family or are they paid? And those lines can get blurred. And then often there can be a real challenge where it's like, well, you weren't there when I needed you most. It's like, yeah, because my shift is over and I'm not family.
And well, it's kind of like what you were saying with the AI bot too. It's like, you're not like giving back to that person. Like that person's not giving back to you. Like they're getting paid, right?
Often there are different types of relationships. They can bleed into one another at times. But what's interesting about that is I don't know about dependent they are, but what we do see is that resources change the trajectory of what relationships look like. So if you're in a city where rent is so expensive, well, maybe you move in together after 6 months or a year or 18 months instead of 2 or 3 years. So the speed at which things happen because there is other pressure. You can have economic pressure. You could have social pressure. It could be families. There's all sorts of other things that weigh on the speed at which we move in relationships. But that's also timeliness. It could be like when you particularly meet someone, what else is going on in the world? Are you afraid of disease or natural disaster or war? Or there's all sorts of things that can apply pressure that changes the speed. What's interesting is that in the Middle Ages, we saw examples of people getting married, and a lot of it had to do with land and resources. Yeah. And so a lot of your decisions were about family members and your legacy and your dynasties. But peasants always married for love. They always married for love because they didn't have to worry about moving land around and stuff. So you are right that resources play a role, but what that role looks like in different places and time, sometimes it speeds things up, sometimes it slows them down, sometimes it means you're worrying about money and trust funds and family and apartments, and sometimes you're worrying about longevity and just being happy. But resources always have an effect on our romantic and sexual lives, but it's not a linear effect. Sometimes it speeds things up, sometimes it slows them down. It sort of depends on what's going on.
I guess the last question for you before we jump into some takeaways from this convo is like, why do people break the pair bond? Like, obviously breakups, there's many reasons, but like, is there anything from an evolutionary biology perspective that causes them to break?
Oh, gosh. I've long been interested in the sort of on-ramps and off-ramps of our relationships. Psychologists study all the stuff in between. I'm really interested in when and how we get into them and when we get out of them. There's all sorts of reasons. We know one of the reasons people leave relationships is betrayal. You start to, that goal of we're looking for someone we can trust and confide in. When you don't really feel you can trust and confide in a partner anymore, the kind of purpose, the glue that holds you together starts to fall apart. That's the big issue when infidelity leads to breakups. It's really, can you for those that want to stay together, can you find a way to trust each other again? And if you can't, sort of what's the glue? What's the purpose of that relationship? You might stay together, but often it's not about love and it's not about real pair bonding. It's more functional. Like we have a house, we have kids, we have a mortgage, we have family obligations. And there's plenty of people who stay married or stay in a relationship. That's why I often talk so separately about marriage as a sort of social cultural institution and the biology of pair bonding, of feeling in love with someone. They don't always align for any number of reasons. Ideally, they do, but they often don't. Well, I shouldn't say they often don't. They sometimes don't. And, with breakups, when we look at breakups, there's a lot going on. In one of our studies, we found about 50% of singles have had yo-yo relationships, on again, off again relationships. You break up, you get pulled back in. You break up, you get pulled back in. I think that's often about, if you love someone, ending a love bond is difficult. I mean, Mother Nature takes her pound of flesh when you try to end that relationship. When you have love evolved to be such an intense response that when it gets pulled away, it could be challenging. And in fact, colleagues of mine put people who are romantically in love and going through romantic rejection into an fMRI brain scanner, and regions of the brain associated with addiction light up. So as you pull that partner away, you feel you have a craving for them, even if the relationship ended for a seemingly good reason. And I think that's where it's important to remember that feeling in love with someone and having a healthy relationship are not the same thing. In fact, I think one of the greatest challenges that so many of us unfortunately have to learn the hard way is when you have a relationship where you say, I love this person, but that's not enough for a healthy relationship with you. That because what's going on in the brain and the feelings in our bodies and the feeling of love, that doesn't mean that all the pieces are lining up for healthy and sustainable relationships. But what can happen in breakups is you might cognitively say, this isn't working, I need to get out. Even if in extreme cases, maybe I'm abusive, you're abusive, there's issues in a relationship, but you can still feel that pull of feeling connected to someone. And that's a challenge. But I think the more we know, the more, as a takeaway of that, the more we understand that, the more we understand about who we are and what we are and how our love operates in the human animal, then we can take control of our lives. We can be masters of our destiny in more ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think that leads into my takeaways of just like this conversation and reading your book. There's just like, clearly relationships and love and dating, it's all at the forefront of society. And like, why do we put so much emphasis on it? And I feel like this element of pair bonding and what you described here just puts it all in perspective. And you had this one quote I want to read that was, our commitments to loved ones through thick and thin are truly remarkable. To live and die for love is not what makes us human per se, but is one of the most striking hallmarks of our humanity. And I just thought that was like so beautifully written and just encompasses like why we do all the things that we do to get there. So I think that like just the whole conversation of like what it means for love and relationships, that is a huge takeaway. The other piece that I have is this dichotomy of the staying, of like bonding and attachment versus novelty and attraction to others, and how they're like a constant at ends with each other, and like thinking about like, okay, this is the priority to like balance both of them. And that doesn't mean that you stray and leave your relationship, but you bring into your relationship. That was like definitely an aha moment for me, to just think of like, okay, there is a priority of like that novelty and bringing that in, whether that's sexually or just trying new activities together or going different, like not just falling into routine, which is easy to do when you're in a long-term relationship.
Oh, yeah.
It's very easy to fall into routine. And like, how do you bring back some of these elements? Like, I even, like my partner and I try to do like a date night every Wednesday. And so many times it doesn't happen. Like, we'll just watch TV instead. And I'm like, I need to get out of those like ruts and be like, okay, we actually need to make this a huge priority to do the thing to keep that novelty going.
Yeah. And it could be, it's, you know, sometimes it's something great. It's like, okay, we're going to go take a vacation to the Caribbean for a week. Maybe that's not in the budget this year, but what we are going to do is we're going to find a recipe that we've never made and do it. And just having that the newness, the novelty, and that's what we see in those long-term relationships, that's attainable for all of us.
And then my very last takeaway is just around empathy and building empathy, whether that's your dating and long-term relationships. I think what you shared about that, of just like how that is the glue of like what makes you just like want to continue to like invest in someone and be with someone, that's like another reason to flex that empathy muscle.
I agree. We all can have, I think the more we know, the more compassion we can have for ourselves and our relationships and each other, and enjoy those relationships.
I often think about my parents and how they started out as strangers and now they're closer than family. And I still think this is probably one of the most beautiful human experiences we possibly could have in our lifetime. So for anybody who's giving up on love and dating, look at it as just that. It's an experience you get to have and create with someone. Why not take advantage of this opportunity you have? Because only humans get to experience this. And I think what I've learned from this conversation is multiple things can be true in a relationship, and we have to hold both of them with equal weight. Like, you can still love your partner and still want sexual novelty, and like that. Both of those can be true. And I think oftentimes in relationships, we don't acknowledge the tension of the two truths. So that's something to bring to the forefront of my relationships too, is to think about, how do we recognize the tension, and then how do we find a path forward without disregarding either of those truths. And I do think what you said was so interesting. I think relationships operate better when there are constraints. I remember I had this relationship in New York where we were both piss poor. So we would set a budget for $100 a weekend. We both contribute $50 and we see what we do with that. And it was like the most fun we ever had because we had these constraints. So I think sometimes in relationships, we look at constraints and pressure as something that's bad and putting stress on our relationships. Now it's like, how do you look at that as an opportunity to adapt and to kind of evolve this relationship and get really creative with it. Your example of, if we can't go on vacation, let's look at a recipe of the place we actually want to go to and, create this experience for the both of us. I forget that sometimes, that you can do that with someone and do it within the constraints that you have. So thank you for bring that up.
Thank you. I love the $100 date idea. I think that's so cute. I really think, because it's a game. It's a challenge of like, all right, what can we fit in here? I like that one. So, thank you.
Love it. For anyone that wants to read the book and learn more about you, where can they go, Justin?
Oh, sure. So The Intimate Animal is available everywhere books are being sold. And if they want to know more about me, I'm on social media at Dr. Justin Garcia. And about all of our research program and educational activities, they can follow the Kinsey Institute, and we'll post a lot of information. And I'd welcome it, and I welcome hearing from folks. I'm thankful to both of you for the opportunity to talk about my work and The Intimate Animal, and I invite others to join us.
Wonderful way to wrap this up.
Stay dateable.